Grumpy Old Women, BBC Two in half an hour.
The great civilization of ancient Egypt. In this programme, I'm off on the trail of Egypt's most controversial ruler and his beautiful wife. Of all the stories that come out of the great land of ancient Egypt, one that I find most fascinating is the epic tale of the ruler who had everything, but ultimately sacrificed it all. He was a rebel, a revolutionary. To the ancient Egyptians, he was a heretic, a man with very dangerous ideas. Ideas that would lead his nation to the very brink of catastrophe. But this man was a pharaoh, a living god, and he could, and did, change everything. Religion, politics, art, even language. This pharaoh is now probably best known for his connection with another man, Tutankhamun, who was probably his son. My pharaoh's name, though, was Akhenaten, and I'm fascinated to find out more about him. My first stop is to see some of the rare statues of Akhenaten still in existence. In this gallery are 4 colossal statues of Akhenaten, and are they not sensational? Just look at this. What an amazing, expressionistic piece of sacred art. Here you're seeing a pharaoh as he'd never been shown before and would never be shown again. Just look. Usually, pharaohs are depicted as conventionally handsome, strong, and manly. But Akhenaten's statue is completely different. So strange. Look at that elongate. People ever since they were discovered in the early 20th century. But I guess one thing we know about Egyptian sacred art, nothing happens by accident, everything has a meaning. Akhenaten clearly meant to be seen as different from all other pharaohs. His strange enigmatic portrait looks serene, but in fact he threw Egypt into chaos. To understand what happened, I have to go back to the beginning of Akhenaten's reign, to the golden years of the ancient Egyptian Empire. At that time, nearly 3,500 years ago, Egypt was the richest and most powerful empire in the world. It had vast resources and wealth. Its people were well fed and the harvests were plentiful. The pharaoh's sumptuous royal temples and palaces were laden with treasure. The Egyptian army was all-conquering. The Egyptians believed that all this wealth, all this success, was only theirs because they kept the gods happy. There were priests to ensure the deities were worshipped in exactly the right way to keep Egypt stable and prosperous. There were about 2,000 gods in all, governing every aspect of life. The king of the gods was called Amun. But in this deeply religious country, to displease any of these gods could bring bad luck to the whole nation. Virtually everything left to us from ancient Egypt bears witness to the importance religion, 1,500 years old. Akhenaten came along and changed everything. From very early in his reign, the Pharaoh Akhenaten and his beautiful wife Nefertiti decided to challenge the entire belief system of ancient Egypt. This golden couple were prepared to rock the very foundations of the Egyptian worldview. And all because Akhenaten had undergone an extraordinary personal religious conversion. He had a dramatic, revolutionary idea. He wanted to replace the pantheon of Egyptian gods with just one god. And at the time he proposed this idea was heresy. For the first time in history, a pharaoh was suggesting that there might be just one god, the creator of... From now on, everyone was only to believe in the sun god, the Aten. There's one place in Egypt where I can see that remarkable moment of religious change as it happened. I've come to the tomb of Akhenaten's vizier, his chief minister, Ramosa. But the sudden shift from the old religion to the new is captured right here, on the walls of the tomb. To proclaim his high status for eternity, vizier to a pharaoh, Ramosa has himself shown in his tomb with a pharaoh, Akhenaten. Here he is. Behind Akhenaten sits Mat. Mat was a traditional goddess of Egypt. So on this wall, carved when the tomb was first being created, Ramosa had the old gods depicted. But dramatic change takes place as I walk across. This image could only have been created a few months, maybe a few years later, but a revolution has taken place in art and indeed in theology, I suppose. In front of me is Akhenaten, but above all is the Aten. The gods have gone, the gods of ancient Egypt, the gods in human form, animal form, replaced by the abstract single god of the Aten. The sun pouring down rains of life upon the king. This is an amazing image. From one to the other, one sees at a glance the revolution that took place during the reign of Akhenaten. Couple's next announcement would be even more shocking. Akhenaten now abandoned the ancient sacred city of Thebes, the heart of the whole nation, and headed north along the river to found a new utopia. And that's just where I'm going. I'm following in the footsteps of Akhenaten. In the 4th year of his reign, he chose to leave Thebes, modern-day Luxor, the city of his ancestors, to sail up the Nile in search of a location for a new city. Clearly, he wanted a clean break with the past. He wanted to break with the old gods to found a new city for his new god, the Aten. He travelled north for about 200 miles along the river, away from Thebes, looking for the perfect spot for his magnificent new metropolis. Eventually, he ended up here at modern-day Al-Amarna, and he built a city, the remains of which can still be seen. It's in ruins now, but Akhenaten and Nefertiti chose this bleak, lonely piece of desert for their vast new sacred city. I couldn't help wondering why they decided to build their paradise here, so far away from civilization and comfort. Up in the hills that surround the ancient metropolis, there's a place to start looking for the answers. In front of me, in the rocks up here is a huge engraved stone called a stela. This one carries a public proclamation composed by Akhenaten himself. Sun god said, "Build here," and it came to pass. The city was built. Akhenaten called his city Horizon of the Aten. But why did he think the Aten was telling him to build here? Well, it appears he'd seen a sign. Forms a shape rather like this. At certain times of the year, the sun, the Aten, rises between the peaks in this cleft, creating this shape. And that is the hieroglyph for horizon. A hieroglyph which incorporates the sun, the Aten. And so Akhenaten believed that the Aten was telling him this was the place in which to build this sacred site, this sacred city. The great city was built at breakneck speed. It took thousands of people dragged in from far off Thebes to build it, decorate it, administer it. Against all the odds, Akhenaten's vision of a religious utopia was becoming a living, breathing city. Wells were dug, trees and gardens planted. And palaces all over the city. They were beautifully decorated, as these wall paintings, discovered amongst the ruins, clearly show. Up to 50,000 people came to live here, courtiers, administrators, advisors. This became the new political and religious heart of the nation, the centre of the new cult. Akhenaten vowed never to leave this place, and, as far as we know, he never did. Detailed carvings discovered here at Amarna have revealed how the royal family Nefertiti cuddling some of their 6 little daughters. It's so intimate. It's like a family snapshot. There's one daughter on Nefertiti's shoulder, while she cradles another on her lap. And here a daughter hugs the Pharaoh Akhenaten himself. No royal family had ever been depicted showing affection like this before. A mighty pylon standing here. And these are the mud brick remains of that pylon, once rising right up high above me. In that respect, this temple would have looked outwardly much like the traditional temples to the old gods. But once one got in here, all was very, very different indeed. The old temples culminated in a series of increasingly small and dark rooms, but here all was open to the sky. And here worshippers would have placed their offerings to the great sun, to the Aten, and stood, I say, embathed with energizing. In the tombs of Amarna, you can see carvings of the citizens bowing down to the royal couple, praying through them to the sun god, the Aten. This was the pinnacle of the royal couple's fabulous dream. Akhenaten had successfully established a new city, a religious paradise in the desert. He had declared himself the Son of God, and he appeared to have brought about religious revolution in Egypt. But then it all started to unravel. It soon became obvious that most of Akhenaten's subjects, even those living right here, under his nose in Amarna, didn't really believe in the Aten, the sun god, at all. Buried in the back rooms of people's houses, archaeologists have found statues of the old gods. It seemed that Akhenaten must have found out about his people's disloyalty. He became grimly intolerant of those who didn't believe in his new cult. He ordered that all images of the old gods were to be found and destroyed, especially those of the chief of the old gods, Amun. Even their names were to be obliterated. Here you can see evidence of the intensity of the campaign of obliteration that Akhenaten launched against the old god, Amun. This is the top of an obelisk that once stood 27 meters high, and here, at its very tip, and soldiers climbing the top of this obelisk that was, of course, standing in Akhenaten's time. Incredible chipping to consign the god, well, to obliteration, to remove his memory, to literally kill him. Sometime later, someone's tried to recut and very nasty indeed. The army was now called in to help find and destroy every trace of the old gods, rather than defending Egypt's borders. And because Akhenaten refused to leave his beloved city, he was seen as weak and the country vulnerable to invasion. A fascinating archaeological find here in Amarna sheds light on the problems Akhenaten's policies were causing Egypt and its empire. rooms. And the tablets they found were like this. These are replicas, exact replicas of some of the tablets. These tablets are very, very revealing about the nature of his court, about his diplomatic relations, about his foreign policy. This letter is from the ruler of one of Akhenaten's vassal states, a neighbouring country protected by Egypt. He's asking Akhenaten for troops to help ward off the Hittites, Egypt's arch enemies. This poor king is begging Akhenaten to send troops. And he says, I've asked you, I get no reply, you won't send me the aid I need. Akhenaten doesn't. And this vassal state falls into the hands of the Hittites, lost to Egypt. It's incredible. So obviously what the pictures gives see to affairs of state. And for that reason, Egypt is the loser. It loses power, it loses possessions, it loses income, it loses its status in the world. It's very, very serious indeed. It seems that in his remote desert utopia, Akhenaten's dream was beginning to crumble. And then personal tragedy struck. It's a tragedy that's heartbreakingly depicted on the walls of Akhenaten's own tomb. Despite being terribly damaged, these images do offer startling insights into Akhenaten's solar-based utopia. Here we see a scene of mourning. One of the princesses has died. One can just make out figures of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And this was very strange about this depiction here. We see the royal family showing grief, literally crying. Now, that's unprecedented in Egyptian art. The royal family is never shown displaying such human emotion. They're weeping, they're crying over the death of one of their children. There's a small body lying dead on a little bed here. There's evidence to suggest that Akhenaten didn't lose just one daughter. It seems that another princess died at around the same time. But what was it that was killing Akhenaten's family? It seems likely it was plague. Archaeological evidence suggests that plague was sweeping the country at the time. And this type of epidemic could have killed up to 40% of the population. Because he was the pharaoh, Akhenaten would have been held personally responsible for any plague in his reign. People would have begun to believe that this catastrophe was because the old gods were offended, because Akhenaten had replaced them with a single deity. But just when it seemed that nothing could get any worse, Akhenaten lost the woman who had been at his side from the start. This is, as far as we know, last depictions ever made of the great queen. What we get from this is the idea that something is going wrong in the land. Paradise was now on the verge of collapse. For those around him, his advisors and courtiers, he must have seemed a dangerous liability. The country was losing its wealth and power. Perhaps the pharaoh had to be replaced. 13 years after the foundation of the city, Akhenaten died. Some people believe He was murdered by courtiers or generals who felt that the circumstances of Akhenaten's reign could not continue. They believed that Egypt was losing power, prestige and wealth. The old gods had to be reinstated. Their favour was needed. Akhenaten's death meant the cult of the Aten was over, and Amarna lost its purpose. The city died. It was abandoned. And I imagine the population was quite glad to leave this strange sight, no doubt feeling the city was cursed by the old gods. And then all was systematically demolished, obliterated. The idea, I suppose, was to remove the memory of this city, along with the memory of Akhenaten and the memory of the heresy of the Aten. It was Tutankhamun, Akhenaten's probable son, who was Pharaoh when Amarna was abandoned. He restored the old gods and set Egypt back on the path to power and prosperity. He took the court, the army, and the entire population of Amarna back to the ancient capital city of Thebes. The priests returned, more powerful than ever, and life in ancient Egypt returned to normal. No Egyptian pharaoh ever again tried to change the established order or challenge the traditional gods. Those who came after Akhenaten tried to destroy all traces of him and his heretical cult. His statues were toppled, his image was plastered over, his name chipped out of every carving. Then they used his toppled statues and temple blocks as rubble to fill the walls of new temples. The very stones had to be robbed of meaning. They had to be Akhenaten's image for us today. In the 1920s, the stones from the temple to the Aten started to emerge. And now we know much about Akhenaten and the Aten from these stones. So, in this strange irony, by burying the stones, Akhenaten and the cult of the Aten has lived on for posterity, for eternity. Next time,
The life of luxury in modern Arabia. Dubai Dreams at 8.
Of Akhenaten's reign to the golden years of the ancient Egyptian empire. At that time, nearly 3,500 years ago, Egypt was the richest and most powerful empire in the world. It had vast resources and wealth. Its people were well fed, and the harvests were plentiful. The Pharaoh's sumptuous royal temples and palaces were laden with treasure. The Egyptian army was all-conquering. Out of the great land of ancient Egypt One that I find most fascinating is the epic tale of the ruler who had everything, but ultimately sacrificed it all. He was a rebel, a revolutionary. To the ancient Egyptians, he was a heretic, a man with very dangerous ideas. Ideas that would lead his nation to the very brink of catastrophe. But this man was a pharaoh, a living god, and he could, and did, change everything. Religion, politics, art, even language. This pharaoh is now probably best known for his connection with another man, Tutankhamun, who was probably his son. My pharaoh's name, though, was Akhenaten, and I'm fascinated to find out more about him. My first stop is to see some of the rare statues of Akhenaten still in existence. In this gallery are 4 colossal statues of Akhenaten, and are they not sensational? Just look at this. What an amazing, expressionistic piece of sacred art. Here you're seeing a pharaoh as he'd never been shown before and would never be shown again. Just look. Usually, pharaohs are depicted as conventionally handsome, strong, and manly. But Akhenaten's statue is completely different. So strange. Look at that elongated. People ever since they were discovered in the early 20th century. But I guess one thing we know about Egyptian sacred art, nothing happens by accident, everything has a meaning. Akhenaten clearly meant to be seen as different from all other pharaohs. His strange enigmatic portrait looks serene, but in fact he threw Egypt into chaos. To understand what happened, I have to go back to the beginning.
Grumpy Old Women, BBC Two in half an hour.
The great civilization of ancient Egypt. And in this programme, I'm off on the trail of Egypt's most controversial ruler and his beautiful wife. Of all the stories that come